Introduction. As the decades-long struggle in Southeast Asia came to a climax in the spring of 1975, the United States Navy and Marine Corps saved thousands of U.S. citizens and pro-American Vietnamese and Cambodians from victorious communist forces. To the American public, the precipitate withdrawal of the United States from Cambodia, and especially South Vietnam, presented the disconcerting spectacle of the abandonment of allies and, on a more human level, of a host of individuals who had worked and fought for common aims. Yet behind the undeniably tragic elements of the picture, the evacuations highlighted the skill and courage of American uniformed personnel in the midst of chaos. Setting the stage for this last act in one of America's longest wars was the Paris Agreement of January 27, 1973, engineered by President Richard M. Nixon and Secretary of State Henry A. Kissinger. This treaty offered the United States peace with honor by bringing home American prisoners of war and ending combat operations for the U.S. Armed Forces. Under terms of the accord, only vestigial remnants of the American Expeditionary Force would stay in South Vietnam to provide training for that country's armed forces. By 1974, about 8,500 U.S. personnel remained as civilian advisors, with 5,000 contracted to maintain South Vietnamese military equipment for America's allies in the region. The Paris Agreement called for elections that were never held and a ceasefire. This latter provision meant slightly more than 100,000 North Vietnamese troops remained in South Vietnam. To placate the uneasy South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu, the Nixon administration secretly offered assurances that if the Communists broke the accord, the United States would intervene with force as it had done in 1972, when American air and naval forces played a critical role in turning back the North Vietnamese Easter Offensive. In a comparison of forces following the Paris Agreement, the Saigon government held a strong hand. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, numbered 650,000 regular and regional soldiers, with most units well equipped with American weapons. The Vietnam Air Force, VNAF, was by some estimates the fourth largest in the world. The Vietnam Navy, VNN, in terms of sheer numbers of combatant ships, 97, ranked among the top 10 fleets of the world. Unfortunately, as skeptics had foreseen, the tenuous Paris Agreement quickly unraveled. Anticipating war, both sides set out to secure and enlarge the territories they already held. In Laos, Hanoi-led forces, including the indigenous Pathet Lao, continued their offensive against the Royal Laotian government. In Cambodia, the ARVN launched a large campaign. When this failed, the radical Cambodian communists, Khmer Rouge, waged an increasingly successful attack on the Phnom Penh government of Lon Nol, whose regime by late 1974 was able to hold little more than the capital itself. Moreover, political turmoil swirled in the United States around the Watergate affair. The scandal involved Nixon's direction of illegal activities and his concerted effort to cover up those crimes for which he was compelled to resign from office in August 1974. The odium of Watergate compromised the ability of the executive branch under President Gerald R. Ford to take forceful measures in the event of a major communist offensive in Southeast Asia. Congress reflected the American public's weariness with the war, and it became more assertive in cutting back on funding for Southeast Asian military forces. Many Americans also considered the governments of South Vietnam and Cambodia corrupt and wasteful. The oil crisis of 1973 and subsequent inflationary pressures on the U.S. Economy intensified calls for the Ford administration to slice aid going to South Vietnam and Cambodia. The communist leadership in Hanoi, emboldened by Nixon's resignation and realizing direct U.S. intervention was not likely, took aggressive steps to exploit the situation. In 1974, North Vietnamese forces began widening and paving the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They even constructed a pipeline from North Vietnam into South Vietnam's Central Highlands. By the end of the year, the North Vietnamese almost doubled their troop strength in the south to 200,000. On the ground, the Communists probed more vigorously, scoring a major success with their seizure and occupation of Phuoc Bin northeast of Saigon. In January, the North Vietnamese overran the entire province of Phuoc Long, as Communist forces in South Vietnam became more aggressive. The Thieu government began planning to withdraw ARVN units from its northern provinces and concentrate them around main population centers, especially Saigon and Da Nang. But to avoid provoking a panic, South Vietnamese authorities took few concrete steps to implement their fallback preparations. As the fortunes of American-backed regimes in Southeast Asia spiraled downward in 1974, U.S. planners drew up a series of options for withdrawing American citizens and local supporters. These plans, as they evolved, offered U.S. leaders a wide menu of choices, ranging from flights by civilian air carriers or military fixed-wing aircraft to embarkation aboard civilian and naval ships to the more extreme measure of helicopter evacuation. Timetable for offensive action. Also complicating the picture was the Byzantine command structure of the American armed forces in the region. One key individual was Air Force Lieutenant General John J. Burns, commander of U.S. Support Activities Group, USAG, the remnant of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MCV. Headquartered at Nakhon Phanom, Thailand, Lieutenant General Burns was subordinate to Admiral Maurice F. Weissner, Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Pacific Command, SINCPAC, in Hawaii. But Lieutenant General Burns, dual-hatted as head of the 7th Air Force, was also responsible to the commander of the Pacific Air Forces, PACAF, headquartered in the Philippines. Such a setup seemed to guarantee confusion at the most inopportune moments. The sea service tools available to these leaders looked, at least on paper, adequate for the task ahead. The Marines held ready the 9th Marine Amphibious Brigade, comprising regimental landing team, 4 backed by aircraft, logistics, and evacuation security forces. In late March, the landing team was located in Japan, but soon moved to Okinawa. In the second week of April, it moved to Subic Bay in the Philippines. There, it embarked on naval ships, with a brigade headquarters aboard the Amphibious Command Ship Blue Ridge LCC-19. Navy planners increased the assets available to the commander of the 7th Fleet, in part by delaying the scheduled return to the U.S. west coast of the battle group built around the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier Enterprise, CN-65, as well as 1 amphibious squadron. Thus, 4 carriers were on station by the end of March rather than the usual 3. 2 amphibious squadrons, rather than 1, stood ready. Augmenting sea lift capabilities were 8 ships controlled by the Military Sea Lift Command, MSC. While the numbers of these forces were impressive, the quality of American military units, of whatever service, was suspect by 1975. The long Vietnam War had engendered disdain for the military in some American circles. During the closing stages of the conflict, drug and alcohol usage in Southeast Asia attracted such attention that the Navy ran several large urinalysis screenings of sailors and Marines. although fewer than 0.5% tested positive. Anecdotal evidence suggested the true figure was much higher. Adding to the Navy's contemporary problems were racial divisions, festering aboard many Navy ships. These problems led to violence on several in the fall of 1972, including riots aboard the aircraft carrier Kitty Hawk, CVA-63, and the fleet oiler Hisayampa, AO-145. Following a sit-down strike on the aircraft carrier Constellation, CVA-64, Admiral Elmo R. Zumwalt, Jr., the Chief of Naval Operations, concluded racism was endemic in the entire structure of the Navy. To help relieve tensions, the Admiral established racial awareness, equal opportunity, and other programs. Zumwalt's successor as CNON. 1974, Admiral James L. Holloway III continued the most successful of these initiatives. The collapse in 1 and 2 Corps. The capability of America's armed forces would be tested to the utmost in the spring of 1975. Operation Frequent Wind planning became urgent as the South Vietnamese armed forces fell apart under the pressure of the 1975 Communist offensive. Hanoi planners had anticipated victory in 1976. They were surprised at the rapidity of the South Vietnamese collapse in 1975. 3 North Vietnamese divisions opened the offensive on March 10th against Ban My Thuot. After hard fighting, the Communists seized the city on March 12th. An ARVN counterattack failed. South Vietnamese troops, in an ominous development, began to desert in droves. 2 days later, President Thieu ordered withdrawal from the Central Highlands. Despite stout resistance by some ARVN soldiers, too many units panicked. U.S. Army Chief of Staff General Frederick C. Wyan told President Ford, this strategy was sound in concept, and Thieu's estimate of its necessity was correct. Its execution, however, was disastrous. Hanoi, surprised that confusion and chaos reigned in the South, moved quickly to take advantage of the situation. On March 19th, Communist troops opened another offensive just south of the demilitarized zone. 6 days later, they entered Hue. By the end of March, Communist troops occupied 1/4 of South Vietnam and inflicted more than 150,000 casualties on the ARVN, as well as destroyed 1/2 of Saigon's combat aircraft. One demoralized Saigon official compared the fall of provincial capitals to an avalanche. The retreat became a debacle. 6 of the 13 ARVN divisions simply disintegrated. Throngs of refugees, estimated by U.S. Ambassador Graham Martin in Saigon at more than 500,000, flocked to the coastal cities. As the South Vietnamese military effort collapsed into impotence and chaos, ad hoc relief efforts begun by the Vietnam Navy encountered the most appalling conditions. Already hamstrung by budget cuts of 80% during the preceding 3 years, Vietnamese naval officers concluded in March 1975 that only 31, 1 destroyer escort, 6 cutters, 5 minesweepers and patrol craft, 14 landing craft, and 5 oilers of their 45 large ships were ready to embark refugees. Shortages abounded in everything from immunity, tie-in to fuel to toilet paper. To assist in the evacuation, representatives of the remnant American military presence in South Vietnam called the Defense Attaché Office (DAO) Saigon and requested Military Sea Lift Command to dispatch surface ships to the port city of Da Nang. MSE responded with 4 cargo ships, 5 tugs, and 7 barges, the latter to ferry refugees from shore to the deep draft cargo vessels. VNN Captain Nguyen Xuyen Sun, 1975, In the spring of 1975, Captain Nguyen Xuyen Sun commanded the Fleet Command of the Vietnam Navy. Less than 2 months after his country's fall, Captain Sun was interviewed by Dr. Oscar P. Fitzgerald of the Naval Historical Center, renamed Naval History and Heritage Command in 2008, as an eyewitness to the withdrawal of ARVN forces from the Northern Provinces of the Republic of Vietnam. Captain Sun gave an unflinching account of often chaotic conditions during the evacuation around Da Nang. Captain Nguyen Xuyen Sun, second from the left, commander of the Vietnam Navy Fleet Command, discusses operations with Rear Admiral James B. Wilson, left, the last commander Naval Forces Vietnam, and other officers in 1973. Dr. Fitzgerald was the Navy's role in the I Corps mainly gunfire support? A. Captain Sun, gunfire support, and later on evacuation. Most of the evacuation was done on our ships. It all happened so fast. I could see Da Nang fall with my own eyes from the Navy headquarters on Observatory Island. When we met the South Vietnamese Marines at the rendezvous point, we didn't have enough ships for everyone, so the Marines loaded first, and the Marines stopped the other units from coming into the ships. So most of the Army's 3rd Division was picked up by the second load. The troops' morale was very low. Q. Was this true of the other divisions? A. That's true of everybody. With the withdrawal from Da Nang and the northern provinces, I think the 8 Marines did the best fighting and had the highest morale. They had their individual weapons and carried them. When they boarded our ships, even after swimming through the water and climbing up the ladder. But other units, some of them, just threw their weapons away. Q. Did the Navy have any losses up there in that area? A. We lost one of our LCU's utility landing craft, and I myself was shot down in a helicopter. But I got away and was picked up by the Marine Chief of Staff. It was a funny thing. I was shot down with the commanding general of the 1st Division. I flew with him up to Tan, just to supervise the withdrawal of his troops. We were shot down, and the pilot was calling for rescue. By luck, there was the Air Force helicopter with a Marine Chief of Staff aboard. He was flying to deliver dehydrated rice and other food to his troops. He was trying to get these supplies to his troops. He heard our call for help and flew in to pick us up. Q. Were you actually behind the lines? A. Yes. Q. Was it a close call? A. Oh, yes. Q. Was the evacuation pretty orderly? Once they got to the beach, were you able to control the flow of the people from piling on the ships? A. The Marines did well, very well on boarding the ship, but the 1st Division was no good. With the 2nd Division, we had a terrible experience. They were in Chu Lai. We brought the LST into shore. The bow door opened, and there were about 10,000 people on the beach. People were jamming onto the ship, and there were some people on the backside of the ship throwing grenades and using M79 grenade launchers exploding right on the bow ramp, killing a lot of people. Q. Did the troops do this? A. The troops did this to make room for themselves. Q. Did you have orders to take the troops out first and then the civilians, or did you pick up everybody who was there? A. The order was civilians first and troops later. But who could enforce the order? Everybody had a gun, and they were fighting for their own life. On March 29th, the Department of Defense designated Singpak Admiral Weissner as the Vietnamese Refugee Evacuation Coordinator. That same day, MSC vessels began loading refugees amidst scenes of increasing collapse. At Da Nang, as recalled, tens of thousands of government troops and refugees piled onto the piers, pushing and shoving, trampling some of their numbers to death, knocking others into the water. Thousands more tried to wade out to the ships, preventing them from getting close enough to dock. As frantic refugees swam out to the vessels, North Vietnamese artillery took them under fire. The cargo ship USNS SGT Andrew Miller, TAK 242, and the char-tiered tug Chitos Maru departed the port for Cam Ranh Bay with more than 10,100 refugees aboard. The next day, MSC's cargo ship, SS Pioneer Commander Wade, anchor-packed with more than 8,000 people. On March 31st, cargo ships SS Pioneer Contender, SS Trans-Colorado, and 3 tugs followed, bringing the number of evacuees from Da Nang to 34,600 in 3 days. Many others were left quayside for lack of room. Despite the air of incipient chaos, some Vietnam Navy units performed well. One tank landing ship, LST, that usually carried a maximum of 1,000 troops, was packed with 6,000 people. So crowded was another vessel that its crew could not use the ship's weapons against shore targets because of the press of people surrounding the guns. Captain Nguyen Xuyen Sun, the last commander of the Vietnam Navy's Fleet Command, recalled, "On my flagship, we had 2,500 Marines on. Dense fog and low tide kept the rescue ships offshore. Yar Vien resistance crumbled." One Vietnamese naval officer observed they were abandoning all their tanks along the road, and none of the soldiers had any weapons. When they arrived here, they threw them aside, even with no enemy attack. Another, Bosun's Mate Second Class Truman Ellsbury, a Durham sailor, holds on to 2 Vietnamese children during the chaotic evacuation of refugees from northern and central Vietnam in the spring of 1975. The ship, a WHEC high-endurance cutter, which normally carried a crew of 118 men, Cam Ranh Bay proved the most transitory of stops. As the situation worsened ashore, evacuation of that facility began April 1st with the departure of Trans-Colorado loaded with 7,000 refugees. For more than a week, these tragic scenes were repeated as a motley array of craft worked their way down the South Vietnamese coast, picking up refugees at ports such as Can Nan and Nha Trang. By April 11th, 5 chartered and 2 government-owned ships carried nearly 113,000 refugees to supposedly safer areas in the southern part of the country. The Operation, characterized by one observer as perhaps the most difficult in almost 26 years of MSC history, was dogged with problems. The most basic supplies were scarce. The ability of the ship's masters to keep order was tenuous, and command authority higher up the chain remained nebulous. Vice Admiral George P. Steele, commander of the 7th Fleet that operated in the Western Pacific, complained. He had no control over the MSC merchantmen. Vice Admiral George P. Steele, the dynamic commander of U.S. 7th Fleet, oversaw the successful evacuation of tens of thousands of Americans, Vietnamese, and Cambodians from Indochina in the spring of 1975, without security parties aboard the rescue craft. Anarchy often reigned, especially when the final destination of the refugee vessels, islands off the tip of South Vietnam, became known. The largest of these, Phu Quoc, lacked the most basic amenities. Indeed, even such necessities as food and water for the tens of thousands of refugees. Early on April 4th, these problems reached a head when the master of USNS Greenville Victory, T-237, reported his ship, bursting at the seams with an estimated 10,000 people, had been taken over by some of the refugees on board. He had been told to alter course from Phu Quoc to Vung Tau, close to Saigon. Reacting to this emergency, the nuclear-powered cruiser Long Beach, CGN-9, and the destroyer escort Reasoner, DE-1063, hurried to intercept Greenville Victory to ensure the safety of its crew and passengers. Shortly thereafter, Marine detachments boarded USNS and MSC ships transporting refugees with orders to weed out enemy agents and to disarm all refugees, many of whom were South Vietnamese soldiers still carrying their rifles and grenades. The Marines restored order, and by April 7th, conditions for the refugees finally improved with the provision of ample food and medical supplies. By April 10th, the 72,000 people on Phu Quoc had been transferred to Vung Tau. Sailors from the amphibious transport docked Ebook, LPD-8, passed boxes of food and other supplies up the brow of SS American Challenger, anchored off Phu Quoc with thousands of desperate refugees on board. The final curtain in Cambodia. While the North Vietnamese pushed deep into South Vietnam, in Cambodia the Communist Khmer Rouge closed in on the capital Phnom Penh. American commands, principally SINCPAC and Commander, U.S. Support Activities Group / 7th Air Force, had since February 1975 been planning for the city's evacuation, dubbed Operation Eagle Pull. Now, in early April, Nav Y and Air Force staffs refined their plans. When it became clear helicopter evacuation would be essential for withdrawing embassy personnel and Cambodian government leaders, Lieutenant General Burns' staff assembled about 20 large Air Force Sikorsky HH 53 Super Jolly Green Giant helicopters in Thailand. Augmenting these aircraft were 12 Sikorsky CH 53 Sea Stallions of Marine Heave Y Helicopter Squadron 462, HMH 462, flying from the amphibious assault ship Okinawa, LPH-3, and the attack carrier Hancock, CVA-19, just dispatched to the Gulf of Thailand, revealing once again the flexibility inherent in carrier operations. Hancock swapped half her fixed-wing air group for a second Marine Heave Y Helicopter Squadron, HMH 463. In mid-March, Navy planners had considered using an attack carrier like Hancock as a helicopter carrier. Arguments against such a measure included the serious or total reduction in the strike capability of the ship, plus the extraordinary maintenance and supply requirements posed by the newly embarked helicopters. These points led the Joint Chiefs of Staff, JCS, initially to reject the option, but when the count of potential evacuees from the Cambodian capital almost doubled from 666 to 1,172, the JCS ordered an attack carrier with Marine CH-53 helicopters aboard to deploy to Subic Bay. Hancock deployed to the Philippines with 16 CH-53DS, 16 Boeing C-Knight CH-46DS. For Bell Super Cobra AH-1JS and 2 Bell Iroquois/Huey UH-1ES, plus a Marine Battalion Landing Team, BLT, 1/9 of about 480 men. 2 Navy officers conversant with amphibious helicopter operations, an Air Department head and a flight deck officer, flew from the United States to Hancock. Modifications to the ship were easily effected. Sailors painted helicopter spots on the flight deck and provided needed supplies to the Marine unit. Waiting for Hancock was Okinawa, a ship that had been on station in the Gulf of Thailand since early March. Aboard that amphibious assault ship was the 31st Marine Amphibious Unit comprising the amphibious assault ship Okinawa, carrying a complement of Marine CH-53 Sea Stallion helicopters, steams through the South China Sea in March 1975. 350 Marines of BLT 2/4 and 12 CH-53 helicopters. A small advanced Marine team designated a soccer field close to the U.S. Embassy at Phnom Penh as the landing zone. When U.S. Ambassador to Cambodia John Gunther Dean ordered the execution of Eagle Pull. Air Force personnel landed in Phnom Penh on April 12th to coordinate the arrival of the Ground Security Force, composed of 346 Marines of BLT 2/4. The Marines set up a perimeter, and then helicopters from Okinawa flew 287 evacuees. The Sikorsky CH/HH-53 SEA Stallion proved to be a workhorse aircraft for the evacuations from Cambodia and South Vietnam, as well as for the operation to recapture SS Mayaguez. Originally developed for the U.S. Marine Corps, the Sikorsky heavy-lift helicopter powered by 2 turboshaft engines made its first flight in October 1964. The CH-53 was designed with an internal lift capability of 8,000 pounds, a range of 100 miles, and a speed of 150 knots. The helicopters began Vietnam operations in January 1967. Typically 3 men, the pilot, co-pilot, and crew chief, made up the crew, but additional personnel often operated the hoist. The pair of M67.62 millimeters or M2.50 caliber machine guns, and 6-barreled Gatling guns positioned on either side of the helicopter. The upgraded CH-53D model could reach a top speed of almost 200 miles per hour, a range of 540 miles, and lift almost 10 tons or 55 troops. Ultimately, the CH-53 and its many variants flew an array of missions, including assault transport, special operations, mine countermeasures, medical evacua, tie-in, and equipment recovery. Its faults were few, but the CH-53 did require extensive and constant maintenance, especially for its avionics and hydraulics. On balance, the aircraft proved remarkably successful, with 384 A and D models produced for the Marine Corps and Navy. Sikorsky built additional aircraft for the armed forces of several foreign countries, as well as the U.S. Air Force. The 1st Air Force, HH-53B, flew in 1967. With its refueling probe, drop tanks, advanced engines, jungle penetrator, chaff dispensers, infrared electronic countermeasures, and armor, and the follow-on HH-53C quickly took over the combat search and rescue role. Dubbed Super Jawless, HH-53BS were involved in the daring, but unsuccessful, Sunday raid of 1970 to free American prisoners of war held in a camp deep in the heart of North Vietnam. Despite its size, the CH-53 was surprisingly maneuverable, especially in a tactical approach, a tight turn to slow the aircraft quickly. Properly flown, the helicopter could decelerate from 120 knots to a hover in less than 15 seconds, because rapid changes in speed and altitude could endanger the aircraft. By 1975, Air Force regulations discouraged these maneuvers, which handicapped operations during the Mayaguez action. Enemy fire shot down or damaged more than half, 13 of 21, of the helicopters employed in the Ko Tang fight on May 15, 1975. Afterward, military analysts concluded the helicopters lacked sufficient firepower and were improperly aided by crews inadequately trained for the mission. Since the 1975 Southeast Asia operations, the CH-53 has remained a mainstay of the U.S. Armed Forces. Sea Stallions took part in Operation Eagle Claw, the failed attempt in 1980 to free the Americans held hostage by Iran, Operation Desert Storm in 1991, and fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq following the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. That the CH-53 is still in production in the 21st century is a tribute to the basic soundness of its design and its adaptability. including Cambodian President Sokhum Khoi and Ambassador Dean, to warships and the air base at Utapao, Thailand. Among those rescued were 36 press correspondents plus citizens from an array of 12 friendly and neutral countries, including Spain, France, Australia, and Sweden. As a large crowd of Cambodians watched, the Marines withdrew to Phnom Penh's Pochentong Airport. The ground troops then began taking fire from Khmer Rouge 107mm rockets. Helicopters from Hancock and 2 Air Force HH-53s then plucked this rear guard to safety. The timing could not have been closer, within 1 minute of final liftoff. 82mm mortar rounds began impacting the landing zone and the air. Force HH-53 extracting the command element took ground fire, which inflicted slight damage. In all, the helicopters from Hancock and Okinawa flew 99 missiles without firing a shot. However narrow a call, Eagle Pull proved a model operation and served as a useful guide for the much larger evacuation from Saigon, Operation Frequent Wind. Preparations for the Saigon evacuation. As South Vietnam continued to disintegrate, the Hanoi Politburo in late March decided to accelerate its offensive with the goal of capturing Saigon before the onset of the 1975 rainy season. Operation Eagle Pull reinforced the enemy's impression that the United States would not fight to defend the Thieu government. On April 9th, North Vietnamese forces assaulted Chien Loc, only 35 miles northeast of the South Vietnamese capital. Here, the 18th ARVN Infantry Division resisted doggedly, but the town fell to the enemy on April 22nd. By this point, the American authorities faced the increasing likelihood of the collapse of the entire South Vietnamese war effort. Planning responsibilities for the probable evacuation fell on Vice Admiral Steele and Brigadier General Richard E. Carey of the composite 9th Marine Amphibious Brigade. They faced a plethora of uncertainties. Marine Brigadier General Richard E. Carey, commanding officer of the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade, on the bridge of the attack carrier Hancock, CVA-19. How many American citizens needed rescue? What about foreign nationals from countries such as the Republic of Korea and the Republic of China? Even harder to ascertain was the number of South Vietnamese to be evacuated. Estimates range from the low thousands to more than 1 million. Ultimately, planners decided to evacuate all South Vietnamese whose lives would be jeopardized by a communist victory. In early April, the United States began flying out on commercial aircraft a trickle of refugees, most famously orphans, in Operation Baby Lift. The humanitarian effort experienced tragedy when a Lockheed C-58 Galaxy cargo plane of the Air Force's Military Airlift Command crashed on April 4th, killing most of the orphans aboard. Marine and Navy helicopters located the C-5's flight recorder, and the salvage ship Deliver, -23 Argentine pesos, recovered key pieces of the aircraft that enabled investigators to pinpoint the mechanical failure, leading to the crash. The Navy played another supporting role in Operation Baby Lift. The Naval Regional Medical Center on Guam provided assistance to children arriving on commercial airliners. When the State Department officially terminated the effort on May 9th, airmen had brought out 2,926 orphans, a number kept low through April by Ambassador Martin, who feared a large-scale exodus would spark panic in Saigon, a well-founded concern. Military planners confronted another great unknown. How would the advancing North Vietnamese react to an American withdrawal? Would they shoot at American rescue helicopters and seaborne evacuation craft? Would their Soviet-built Komar-class missile boats target unarmed U.S. cargo ships, or even naval vessels? And what of the South Vietnamese armed forces? Might they turn their weapons on retreating Americans? Under what conditions could Americans covering the evacuation use their weapons? This last question was so important that orders came down from the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, limiting the use of force to that required to protect and secure evacuation of U.S. nationals and to protect lift assets. Admiral Weissner gave explicit guidelines for confrontations with Komar-class missile boats in international or South Vietnamese waters. Answers to many other questions remained painfully hazy, as did the timing of the operation. How long would the South Vietnamese army hold out? Particularly alarming was the strafing of the South Vietnamese presidential palace on April 8th by a VNAF pilot. Who changed sides? The unwillingness of the U.S. Embassy staff, or more accurately, Ambassador Martin, to envision the total collapse of the South Vietnamese government complicated the job of the uniformed leaders immensely. Marine Brigadier General Carey later remarked, "Suffice it to say that frequent wind was a planning nightmare. We had a plan for all options as best as they could be interred." Preet, one Marine deeply involved in the planning process. Major James E. Livingston later recalled the wide range of options confronting the planners. At one end of the scale lay the overly ambitious choices, such as evacuating up to 1 million South Vietnamese for Vung Tau or moving naval forces up the Long Tau River to set up a defense of Saigon. At the other extreme, Livingston had to develop plans for an evacuation of only American nationals by aircraft flying from Tan Son and Hut Airfield on the outskirts of Saigon. As Livingston remarked, "We had so damn many options I couldn't really keep up with them all." Then, as rapidly changing events in South Vietnam dictated major modifications to the voluminous plans. Unfortunately, the paper machines just about snowed us under. On April 19th, the planners sent to the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations a figure of 203,955 potential evacuees in Saigon, a curiously exact number that gave some indication of the magnitude of the task ahead. That day, the Navy established a unique organization, the Amphibious Evacuation Security Force. The architects of the operation believed the most feasible approach was a massive helicopter evacuation. Brigadier General Carey later remarked, "I wanted very strongly to be able to create a scene where we were coming in with a large force, hopefully to buy some time and confuse people. We wanted to do it rapidly. And the only way you could do that, of course, was with multi-deck helicopter operations. The precise helicopter flow, the precise way that we conducted our multi-deck operations. The exact way it was executed was the same way that we did it at Phnom Penh. In fact, it was basically the same battalion landing team. Much depended on the American forces achieve. ING surprise. Given the large scale of the operation as it unfolded, ships and aircraft were drawn not only from bases in the Western Pacific, but from Hawaii and even San Diego. Schedules changed abruptly. The carrier Hancock and destroyer escort, Kirk, the 1087, had just entered Singapore for a port call. Captain Paul Jacobs, Kirk's commanding officer, later observed, "We had just arrived, tied up, and were ready to shut down the boilers when suddenly we received orders for emergency underway to return to Saigon. After getting all our crew back aboard within 4 hours, we proceeded down the Singapore River at night. As Brigadier General Carey pointed out, secrecy dictated we had to do this against a backdrop of close hold. Don't tip your hand. Don't let anybody know what you're doing. This is political. We're trying to work it out. there may or may not be a settlement, and so on. It's as difficult to move carriers as it is to keep the bar girls in Okinawa from knowing that something's going on. But when the story is told in detail, it'll be a tribute to the Navy and Marines that they did as much as they did with as low a profile as we managed to keep. Complicating preparations were the inter-vice differences. A Marine assessment complained. During the planning phase, many problems surfaced in matters of procedures, ordnance, mission clear, ants and control and communications. Obtaining timely solutions was a difficult task. One of the early plans originating from Lieutenant General Burns' 7th Air Force Headquarters scheduled the helicopter flow in such a way that the Marine aircraft would run out of fuel before returning to their ships. A Marine after-action report noted, "Here was a perfect example of different services using different equipment and different language, not to mention methods of operation." New computer gear proved a mixed blessing. One top Marine complained to 7th Air Force, "I think this is the first major operation we have run using that automated format. I like to see you turn off the computers. Every time there was a change made, we got a complete plan, and you had to read through it because you didn't know what the change was. I must have read that 7th Air Force plan 10 times. I'm not kidding you. And you finally got so confused, you finally just had to stop and say, where in the hell am I? I think the computers just practically swamped us." On the positive side, the new comput heirs aboard the amphibious command ship Blue Ridge showed their value in planning the complex helicopter operations. As one of the Marine architects of the airlift remembered it, the airflow went perfectly. It was absolutely remarkable. Another problem for the planners was micro-management by higher authority, also made possible by advances in technology. A satellite phone hookup connected Washington, the Saigon Embassy, and forces offshore simultaneously. Vice Admiral Steele, who also enjoyed direct communication with the Pacific Fleet headquarters on a real-time basis, noted later, the top guys never bothered to study the details of the plan. They were doing a lot of work by phone, which I object to. They weren't letting their staff do it. Uncertain as to the dimensions of the job at hand, the Navy assembled a major formation. The 7th Fleet's Amphibious Task Force, TF-76 of 46 ships under Rear Admiral Donald B. Whitmire, who flew his flag from Blue Ridge. Nearing the end of one deployment, this warship, equipped with specialized facilities that enabled tactical communications with the extraction and covering forces, suddenly received orders to stand off the coast of South Vietnam. She arrived on station on 3rd April. Vice Admiral Steele elected to work from Blue Ridge instead of riding the fleet flagship, the guided missile cruiser Oklahoma City, CLG-5. Because of the amphibious command ship's excellent tactical communications capabilities, Rear Admiral Donald B. Whitmire, commander of the 7th Fleet's Amphibious Task Force during Operation Frequent Wind, to evacuate and care for the refugees, Rear Admiral Whitmire had 15 amphibious ships, including ING-1 helicopter carrier, Okinawa, plus the attack carriers Hancock and Midway, CVA-41, reconfigured as helicopter platforms. These 3 warships, steaming about 30 to 50 miles south of Vung Tau, carried 77 Marine helicopters, 34-inch 53DS-29, CH-46DS, 8AH, 1JS, and 6 UH-1, plus 10 Air Force CH/HH-53S on Midway. From their decks, a Marine ground security force flew ashore to secure the helicopter landing zones. Surgical and medical teams afloat treated the sick and injured as they came out to the ships. Providing muscle in case hostilities flared between the rescuers and the communists were two attack carriers, Enterprise and Coral Sea, CVA-43, with their embarked air wings. The guided missile cruiser Oklahoma City was also ready to lend her 6-inch guns if needed for fire support. Mobile logistic forces included Replan, Ishman ships, and fleet tugs. Controversial within the Navy leadership was the offloading of attack aircraft from Carey Air's Hancock and Midway. Vice Admiral Steele calculated the risk. I did want to retain a very substantial attack capability because I thought that if it turned into a fight, those carriers were close while the Air Force had to fly and tank, refuel, stuff in. Theoretically, Midway retained a modest strike capability by keeping aboard half her air wing. However, the 10 Air Force CH-53 helicopters of the 56th Special Operations Wing that flew to the ship from Thailand had no rotor blade folding mechanism, so they took up all of the flight deck. Midway's fixed-wing aircraft remained stuck below in the hangar bay. Hancock put ashore her entire air wing to operate the Marine helicopters. One problem in using CVAs as helicopter carriers lay in their medical facilities. The attack ships were not designed to handle large numbers of casualties. Maneuvering stretcher cases through the small hatches and around sharp corners to the sick bay could prove a real challenge. Operating spaces were scant compared to the amphibious ships. As the Task Force 76 report concluded, CVA, even when configured for helicopters, is not a good mini-hospital. But necessity overrode such considerations, and the ultimate verdict read that the CVA as a helicopter carrier is effective from a tactical standpoint. Like the helicopter carriers, Rear Admiral Whitmire's Task Force 76 was an ad hoc organization. Some of its warships heading for home after lengthy deployments had been turned around. For example, Enterprise had just entered Subic Bay on 18th April for a well-earned port call. But no sooner had she dropped anchor than a message arrived advising her to proceed at 25 knots to a holding area of Vung Tau. Within a few minutes of receipt of this message, Enterprise weighed anchor and was again heading west. New to the theater was the tank landing ship Tuscaloosa LST-1187, which hurried out from the west coast, spending but 6 hours at Pearl Harbor before pushing on to Okinawa. There, her crew worked for 51 straight hours offloading cargo and taking aboard Marines and gear. She immediately departed for Subic Bay, steaming the whole distance at full power. Operations at this pace on short-handed ships took a toll on men and machinery. For instance, Coral Sea reported, the engineering plant continued to suffer from many casualties resulting primarily from an inadequate number and training level of personnel. Vice Admiral George P. Steele II, Commander 7th Fleet, watches evacuation operations aboard USS Blue Ridge, LCC 19, during the fall of South Vietnam, April 28, 1975. The attack carrier Enterprise steams in the Pacific. The warship's combat aircraft, which included the first operational squadron of F-14 Tomcats, defended U.S. naval forces evacuating tens of thousands of refugees from South Vietnam. The exodus begins. The endurance of the sailors serving in the South China Sea would be further tested. Transport aircraft that had been flying refugees from Tan Son Nhut Airfield found conditions increasingly challenging. On April 25th, one Giant C-5 Galaxy rolled to a stop only to find an estimated 3,000 people, most of them South Vietnamese military personnel and their families, fighting fiercely for access to the aircraft. Military police were swamped in the human deluge. The flight crew, realizing that a NAF C-130 transport that tried to take off from Tan Son, Nhut burns on the tarmac after being hit by enemy fire, were about to be overrun, slammed the doors on the throng. 2 days after this appalling scene, the North Vietnamese army closed a ring around Saigon and started firing rockets into the city and bombarding the airport. Cutting the last ground route out of the capital on April 28th, the enemy began infiltrating soldiers into the columns of refugees streaming into Saigon. That afternoon, North Vietnamese pilots, flying captured aircraft, struck Tan Son Hut, destroying several planes there. Reacting to the deepening crisis, Hancock dispatched 40 Marines by helicopter to reinforce the security guard at the defense attaché compound on the fringes of the airfield. And Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, owned Air America helicopters began to extract some refugees, including U.S. nationals. In the morning hours of April 29th, rockets fell on the airfield, killing 2 U.S. Marine security guards, Corporal Charles McMahon Jr. and Lance Corporal Darwin D. Judge, the last uniformed Americans to die in Vietnam. That same day, the Saigon government collapsed. Some South Vietnamese fighting men bravely stayed behind to protect their families and take whatever the communists had in store for them. One such individual was the Vietnam Navy's Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Tran Van Chon, who spent the next 10 years in communist re-education camps. Many others in high positions, however, fled the country. In the afternoon, the commander of the VNAF, Lieutenant General Tran Van Min, with 30 staff members, demanded rescue by Americans at the Dow compound. American servicemen disarmed them. They were evacuated several hours later. Some high-ranking individuals opted for Thailand, but others eyed the American ships offshore. 1. Captain, later Rear Admiral, Tran Van Chon, the Vietnam Navy Chief of Naval Operations, confers with U.S. Navy Captain Paul N. Gray earlier in the war. The North Vietnamese imprisoned Chon, a brave and dedicated naval officer, for 10 years after the fall of Saigon. Of the first notables to reach that haven was Nguyen Chau Kai, the former Prime Minister of the Republic of Vietnam, who landed by helicopter together with Ambassador Martin's wife, Dorothy, aboard the amphibious ship Denver, Alpine. Reports soon thereafter reached Task Force 76 that as many as 100 South Vietnamese helicopters at Tan Son Hut were preparing to fly to U.S. ships. The crews of overcrowded South Vietnamese planes departing for Thailand fought soldiers desperate to get aboard. As the situation unraveled in Saigon, President at the Dow compound at Tan Son Hut, the first helicopters landed to the cheers of a waiting evacuees, almost all of whom were overcome by emotion at the sight of the organized and well-disciplined Marines. The sight of these Marines signified to the evacuees there would be a tomorrow. As soon as the Marines disembarked, evacuees scrambled aboard. The helicopters lifted off 6 minutes after touching down. Thus began the largest helicopter evacuation in history. Marine Brigadier General Carey later reminisced, "I'm not sure what you call this." Nguyen Chau Kai, Vice President of the Republic of Vietnam and Lieutenant General No Quang Truong, Commandant of the Vietnam Marine Corps, arrived on board a 7th Fleet ship during the evacuation from Saigon. D-Day, Event Day, or Evac Day, whatever name applied. Frequent wind lasted almost 18 hours. Split command threatened to hinder the pace of operations. When the Marine helicopters flew overland, they fell under the control of Lieutenant General Burns in Thailand. Once they went feet wet, control reverted to Rear Admiral Whitmire on Blue Ridge, further muddying the waters. The operational command of the Air Force helicopters, flying from Midway, remained with Lieutenant General Burns. Thus, the Air Force pilots communicated with 7th Air Force, who passed queries to Blue Ridge, who redirected them to Brigadier General Carey. As one Marine analyst noted, this time-consuming and indirect route created considerable confusion right down to the last minute. Vice Admiral Steele later agreed. Here we had an Air Force element on board a U.S. Navy Ford. Meeting with his advisors in Washington, directed the execution of Operation Frequent Wind. In mid-afternoon, the first CH-53s from Okinawa lifted off carrying the Ground Security Force, GSF, ultimately numbering 865 Marines, who strengthened defenses of the main helicopter landing zone aircraft carrier at sea, under the direct operational control of an Air Force headquarters a great distance away ashore. Yet these potential roadblocks proved more threat than hindrance. As Vice Admiral Steele concluded later, Lieutenant General Burns, Air Force personnel give the thumbs-up sign to one of their HH-53B helicopters, a detachment of which operated from the carrier Midway during Operation Frequent Wind. Certainly stayed out of my hair while the thing was going on, and he could have been very difficult. But he stood back. He let me do the thing. I thought his airborne command post did very well indeed, and I thought the Air Force in general did extremely well. We had a great partnership. At the deck plate level, Vice Admiral Steele noted, the Air Force colonel on Blue Ridge was a very reasonable man, and the closer you get to the people at the scene, the more these sticky, traumatic inter-service control problems tend to go away. Less positive was the situation with communications. The volume of message traffic soared, frequently overwhelming the capacity of ships to handle it. Coral Sea reported communications, already very heavy at 1,100 messages a day, peaking out at 1,800. Equipment failed. The voice circuit linking ships with Marines ashore was down 70% of the time. Marine portable equipment on the ground often proved more reliable than the much more elaborate gear installed on the command ship Blue Ridge. Other problems plagued the communicators. Equipment shortages led Marines at the Dow compound to requisition commercial handheld radio sets from that facility. As the withdrawal accelerated, circuits went off the air. One Marine specialist reported, we had an executive line to the American ambassador, plus other hotlines. But as the day wore on, these became moot because most of the key personnel at these locations became evacuees themselves. Communist jamming posed an intermittent threat, although the transmissions were primarily vulgarity inviting us to get the hell out of the country. Put together, these hurdles meant some of the most urgent messages required 8 hours from release to receipt. Vice Admiral Steele found micromanagement from higher headquarters particularly irksome. Later, he angrily commented, the insatiable demand of Washington authorities for details that they couldn't possibly use actually degrades an operation. I had people worrying me to give them side numbers of 3 Air Force airplanes and helicopters that were supposed to be going into Saigon. I said, and the traffic will show this. This tries my patience to try to figure out what side numbers they are. What could you possibly do with this? It's that kind of pettifogging detail for people who are so far away from the scene that infuriate and tie up the commander from doing things that he really needs to do too. Put his mind, his full intellect, his full experience to bear on the problem he actually faces. To continually appeal to the man for data is just beyond belief. And where the enemy has the capability to hurt you at sea, the provision of data and detail like this causes you to transmit which gives away your location, fixes your position precisely, and is dangerous to you. Asked for the origin of these irritating queries. Vice Admiral Steele responded, "They came from the offices of the Pacific Command and the CNO." He added, "I thumbed my nose, in effect, at some of the messages. What were they going to do, come down the wire and relieve me?" Despite these distractions, the evacuation proceeded swiftly. At the Dow compound, many U.S. citizens were preparing for their second helicopter flight of the day. Plucked earlier from Saigon rooftops by Air America, CIA, helicopters, the evacuees at Tan Son Hut were organized into groups of 50 and led to an empty helicopter by a Marine wearing high-visibility colors. For most of the afternoon, the evacuation from the airfield ran ahead of schedule, but in the early evening, a rainstorm swept the area for 90 minutes. In addition, gunfire from the battle raging around Tan Son Hut hit the compound. One American observer commented, "The ARVN fought well. There was a very, very heavy artillery duel, and they were firing and fighting on both sides of the Dow complex. There was tank fire, there was recoilless rifle fire, and of course the normal small arms/automatic weapons fire. Some of the last from quad dusters, 4.50 caliber machine guns mounted on gun trucks in North Vietnamese hands. Not only were you getting dinged occasionally on purpose, but you were getting dinged, if you will, by the longs and shorts rounds." Adding to the increased sense of urgency was the press of panicked South Vietnamese hoping to escape the fall of their country. Major Livingston, one of the Marines involved in the final stages of the drama at the Dow compound, recalled, "The Vietnamese were trying to get on the helicopter. I didn't kill any, but I thought that I was going to have to kill some of them. I had a couple of M16s and had to shoot at their feet to keep them away. Most of the Vietnamese were PX workers, office workers. I felt terrible about it." Another officer on the scene was Colonel Alfred M. Gray, commander of the 4th Marines and later a general and commandant of the Marine Corps. He remembered, "We got the rest of the evacuees out. We got the ground security force out. We went out in the last 2 helicopters, and prior to leaving we burned and blew the Dow compound. We destroyed the JCS satellite station, and I guess in a bit of sentimentality we blew the house where Army General Creighton Abrams had lived because we didn't want anybody to have that." By the final flight, Marine and Air Force helicopters had snatched from the compound 395 American nationals plus 4,475 other refugees. Loaded with even more tension was the situation late in the day at the U.S. Embassy. None of the complex early planning had envisioned a large airlift from the embassy. In a face-to-face encounter, Ambassador Martin informed Brigadier General Carey 2 Air America helicopters would suffice for the 100 or so individuals likely to need airlift from that location, and that Martin had no intention of conducting a mass evacuation from the embassy. But in the afternoon of the 29th, Carey learned both CIA aircraft would be unavailable. Air America was phased out of the operation at this time. They were all being recovered or crashing out at sea somewhere. Thus, Marine helicopters inherited the mission. Carey asked for an evacuee count. Martin told him rather than 100, the number might exceed 2,500. Making matters worse, only 2 suitable landing sites existed, with the one on the embassy rooftop unfit for the large CH-53. The first helicopters to reach the embassy grounds were 2 CH-40 SXS and 2 medevac helicopters escorted by 2 Cobra AH-1J gunships. These aircraft brought in a much-needed quick reaction platoon of Marines to bolster the embassy guard. This security force was augmented over the next 4 hours by 2 additional platoons, making a total ground security force of 130 plus the 40 original Marines and the landing zone control team. In spite of all obstacles, a helicopter flow of 1Ch-46 and 1Ch-53 began running at 10-minute intervals, trying, in the words of one observer, to empty a bottomless well. Ambassador Martin ordered the evacuees be dispatched at a ratio of 3 South Vietnamese for each American. By early evening, gunfire, random type stuff, described by one officer as almost drunk firing, echoed around the embassy, and shoulder-launched SA-7 anti-air craft missiles threatened the helicopters. The same heavy cloud cover and torrential rains that caused trouble at Tan Son Hut closed down the embassy airlift for 90 minutes. As the situation deteriorated, Martin received a message from Washington. President has authorized 19 helos and no more. You will depart on last lift. Thereafter, helicopters left the embassy grounds with a maximum number of passengers and no baggage. Soon came the instructions, only U.S. citizens and GSF will be taken out from this point. A final communique, tie-in from the embassy read, due to necessity to destroy commo gear, this is the last Saigon message to SEC state. At 0458 on April 30th, the ambassador's helicopter departed the embassy roof. It landed aboard Blue Ridge at 0547. Getting the Marine rearguard out safely proved a hair-raising business. Brigadier General Carey ordered the troops to retire into the building and work their way to the roof, barricading doorways behind them. Although the ground security force fired no rounds, its Marines did employ riot control agents, such as mace and tear gas. The vapors of, which gave the illusion at one point that the building was on fire, and led some of the last helicopters to abort their approaches. Radioed one aviator on the scene, ground fire all around embassy at this time. All GSF are on rooftop and VN in lower floors, apparently looting. Because only the CH-46 with its maximum passenger load of 25 could land on the embassy rooftop, extraction of the last units went forward at a painfully slow pace. But finally at 0747 on April 30th came the signal. Last Americans out of Saigon. All GSF accounted for. Fleet helicopters plucked a total of 978 U.S. civil. Ian's +1. 123rd country and South Vietnamese refugees from embassy grounds following the closure of the landing zone at the Dow compound. The cost to the ground security force was remarkably light. 2 non-battle injuries. A fallen hot electrical line inflicted severe shocks to 1 Marine. Another suffered cuts and abrasions when CH-53 rotor wash blew him off the roof of a building in the embassy compound. Left behind were approximately 400 South Vietnamese and South Korean embassy personnel. 6 more CH-53 flights could have rescued those individuals, but U.S. command authorities never learned of their existence, and thus did not order more missions. Memories of those left behind proved bitter to at least 1 Marine in the rear guard. That morning, there were sick kids, women, children, and ever since then I felt like a coward because I ran out on them. Those people deserved to get out of there, but our government had turned and run on them. With a rescue boat from Blue Ridge standing by, a South Vietnamese Air Force pilot ditches his UH-1 Huey in the South China